The silence in the grand chamber of the Ethel Guardian hegemony was not the silence of peace, but the suffocating stillness of a held breath, a pause in the cosmic rhythm that presaged the collapse of a star. High Counselor Virika sat upon the crystalline throne, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the shimmering, bioluminescent moss that draped the high, vaulted ceilings of the ancient hall. Yet he saw none of the beauty that his people had cultivated over 10,000 cycles of undisputed dominance. His gaze was fixed upon the holographic projection floating in the center of the amphitheater, a swirling, chaotic reenactment of a mistake that had begun as a triumph, and curdled into a dread so profound it chilled his exoskeleton. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of ozone and nervous pheromones, a chemical betrayal of the stoic masks worn by the assembled delegates of the hegemony's 12 subject species. They were waiting for him to speak, to reassure them that the destruction of the human vessel, the Star Treader, had been a necessary assertion of territorial sovereignty rather than the lighting of a fuse connected to a bomb of unimaginable proportions. To his right sat War Prince Kalen, the architect of the attack, his chitinous armor polished to a mirror sheen, his posture radiating a defiance that Virika found increasingly foolish. Kalen believed in the absolute supremacy of Ethel Guardian plasma weaponry, in the divine right of their species to dictate the boundaries of the void. But Virika, old and burdened with the genetic memories of his ancestors, felt the vibrations of a distant, approaching thunder that the younger caste could not perceive. The projection replayed the event again. The human ship, a peaceful, blocky construct of ceramics and alloys venturing too close to the sacred nebula of Othries. The warning shot that Kalen had ordered converted into a kill shot. The way the human vessel had simply disintegrated, its reactor blooming like a dying flower before vanishing into the dark. It had been an easy victory, too easy, and in the 3 standard cycles since that day, the humans had not fired back. They had not sent fleets of retaliation. They had not broadcast threats of vengeance. They had simply gone silent. It was the silence that terrified Virika more than any weapon, for in the silence there was calculation. The gathered counselors shifted in their gravity suspension pods, the low hum of the technology doing little to mask the tension that vibrated through the floor. Virika finally allowed his mandibles to click, a sound that echoed sharply in the vast acoustic perfection of the chamber, drawing every eye to his raised dais. He spoke not with the thunderous roar of a conqueror, but with the measured, rasping tone of a scholar who has read the end of the book and found it wanting. He questioned the wisdom of provoking a species that had traversed the void between spiral arms not with conquest fleets, but with singular, lonely ships of exploration, ships that scanned and catalogued rather than burned and pillaged. Kalen interrupted, his voice booming with the arrogance of the warrior caste, dismissing the humans as soft, arguing that their lack of response was proof of their cowardice, that the destruction of their ship had terrified them into submission. He spoke of the Ethel Guardian supremacy, of the fleets that patrolled the 12 systems, of the orbital cannons that could crack moons, painting a picture of invulnerability that the Assembly desperately wanted to believe. But Virika watched the sensor logs that scrolled rapidly on his private display, data streams provided by the science cast that told a different story. The humans had not fled. They had withdrawn. They had pulled their mining outposts back, recalled their deep space probes, and consolidated their signal traffic into tight, unbreakable beams directed toward a singular point in the dead space between stars, a region of void where nothing existed but dust and cold. Kalen called it a retreat. Virika feared it was a gathering. The debate raged for hours, a circular argument of pride versus caution, with the War Prince demanding a preemptive strike into human space to finish what had been started, and the diplomatic caste pleading for a channel of communication to be opened, to apologize for the accident before it was too late. But the time for apologies had passed the moment the Star Treader turned to ash. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted from political debate to primal fear when the first sensor alarms began to weep, a low, mournful tone that signified a gravitational anomaly of impossible magnitude. It did not originate from the hyperlanes, nor from the standard jump points utilized by every civilized species in the known galaxy. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a sudden brutal distortion of the local spacetime metric that caused the very foundations of the grand chamber to tremble. The holographic projection of the destruction flickered and died, replaced by a real-time feed from the orbital defense grid, and the silence returned, heavier now, crushing the breath from the lungs of every being in the room. On the screen, the stars were disappearing. Not clouded over, not blocked by a nebula, but erased, swallowed by a silhouette so vast that the optical sensors struggled to comprehend its edges. It was not a fleet. It was a single object. It emerged from the tier in reality not with the flash of Cherenkov radiation that accompanied standard FTL travel, but with a deep, resonant thrum that bypassed the ears and vibrated the very marrow of their bones, a sound like the universe itself groaning under a heavy burden. The object blotted out the light of the twin suns, casting the Ethel Guardian homeworld into an artificial twilight, a sudden eclipse born of metal and will. The War Prince stood paralyzed, his mandibles slack, for the scale of the arrival defied all military logic. This was not a ship of war in any sense he understood. It was a continent cast in void black alloy, a construct that did not slice through the vacuum but pushed it aside with brute force. It possessed no visible engines, no glowing exhaust ports, no bristling arrays of plasma cannons. It was a monolith, a sleek, terrifyingly simple shape that resembled a spearhead broken off in the flank of a god, drifting with a momentum that suggested it could plow through the planet below without slowing down. Virika looked at the telemetry data, his mind reeling as the numbers refused to make sense. The mass reading was infinite, or near enough to it that the computers were throwing up error codes for a singularity event. The object was generating its own gravity well, holding itself together against the tidal forces of the system through sheer technological dominance. As the eclipse deepened, lights began to ignite along the spine of the vessel, not the harsh, aggressive red of the Ethel Guardian military, nor the cold blue of the Trade Federation, but a stark, blinding white. They were not running lights, they were windows. Miles and miles of viewports indicating habitation, industry, existence on a scale that rendered the hegemony's capital city a mere village by comparison. The War Prince shouted orders to the fleet, his voice cracking with panic, demanding the orbital batteries open fire, demanding the interceptor squadrons launch, but his commands fell into a void of inactivity. The fleet was not disobeying, the fleet was dead. The energy signatures of every Ethel Guardian ship in orbit had been dampened, not by a virus or a hacking attack, but by the sheer radiological presence of the human vessel. Its passive shielding, the field that kept it from tearing itself apart, was so potent that it acted as an EMP blanket for thousands of kilometers in every direction. The humans had neutralized the mightiest armada in the sector simply by arriving. Virika realized then the magnitude of their error. They had poked a sleeping dragon, thinking it a lizard, and now the dragon had woken not to breathe fire but to simply step on them. A communication channel opened, overriding every frequency, every screen, every personal device on the planet. There was no static, no interference, just absolute clarity. The image that appeared was not of a warrior in power armor, nor a politician in robes of state. It was a human female, seated in a chair that looked more like a pilot's acceleration couch than a throne, wearing a uniform of simple gray with no medals, no ribbons, only a small patch on the shoulder depicting a hammer striking an anvil. Her face was calm, terrifyingly so. There was no anger in her eyes, only a profound, weary disappointment that cut Virika deeper than any rage could have. She did not introduce herself with titles. She did not list her lineage. She simply spoke, her voice translated instantly by the universal linguistic matrix, carrying a weight that made the War Prince tremble. "I am Admiral Halloway of the terraformer-class vessel Prometheus Unbound," she said, looking not at the camera, but seemingly through it into the soul of the hegemony. 3 cycles ago, you destroyed the Star Treader. You claimed it violated your space. You claimed it was a threat. It was a colony seed ship, unarmed, carrying the genetic heritage of a dying world we were trying to save. You broke it. She paused, and in that pause, the entire population of the Ethel Guardian world held its breath. "You broke our ship," she repeated, her voice dropping an octave, becoming soft, intimate, dangerous. "So we built this one." The transmission did not end with a threat. It ended with an invitation. A shuttle was inbound to the Grand Chamber's landing spire, automated, unarmed, requesting the presence of the High Council. The implication was clear. Refusal was not an option. Virika rose from his throne, his old joints aching, and signaled for the War PR. Insi and the lead scientist, Xylos, to accompany him. They walked to the landing platform in a daze, the artificial twilight casting long, distorted shadows across the marble floors. The shuttle that awaited them was a blocky, utilitarian craft, ugly by Ethel Guardian standards, devoid of the elegant curves and organic flows they prized. It was a box with engines, built for function, built to endure. As they boarded, the interior was stark, the seats designed for human physiology but adaptable enough for their exoskeletons. The ascent was silent, the shuttle rising rapidly through the atmosphere, piercing the cloud layer to reveal the monster that hung in the void. Up close, the Prometheus Unbound was even more incomprehensible. The hull was not smooth. It was textured with canyons of machinery, mountain ranges of heat sinks, oceans of sensor arrays. It was a world turned inside out and forged into a ship. As they approached the docking bay, a cavernous maw that could have swallowed the War Prince's flagship whole, Xylos whispered, his voice trembling with scientific awe. It's not utilizing standard propulsion. The readings. High Counselor, they are surfing a localized wave of space-time contraction. They aren't moving the ship, they are moving the universe around the ship. Viraika absorbed this, his fear transmuting into a cold acceptance of inferiority. The humans had leaped 1,000 years of technological evolution in 3 cycles. How? What kind of mind, what kind of species reacts to a tragedy not with immediate violence, but with such focused, obsessive creation? The shuttle touched down on a deck of polished steel, the airlock cycling with a heavy industrial hiss. A delegation of humans awaited them, unarmed, unarmored. Admiral Holloway stood at the front, flanked by engineers and scientists rather than soldiers. The air in the hangar smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and something else, hot metal, the scent of a forge. Holloway gestured for them to follow, and they began a journey through the bowels of the beast. The corridors were wide enough for ground vehicles to pass abreast, the walls lined with conduits that pulsed with a rhythmic, heartbeat-like thrum. They passed immense viewing bays where construction drones the size of corvettes were repairing minor micrometeoroid damage, moving with the precision of surgeons. They passed hydroponic bays that stretched for kilometers, forests growing under artificial suns, entire ecosystems contained within the hull. This was not a warship. It was an ark. It was a civilization wrapped in titanium. You thought, Holloway began, her voice echoing in the vast corridor as they walked, that because we did not fire back we were weak. You mistook patience for fear. She stopped before a massive blast door which groaned open to reveal the ship's heart. It was a chamber of such scale that clouds had formed near the ceiling. In the center, suspended in a magnetic containment field that defied all known physics, was a singularity. A micro-black hole harvested or created, Viraika could not tell, spinning at relativistic speeds, its event horizon glowing with trapped light. The Star Treader ran on fusion, Holloway continued, looking at the singularity with a mix of pride and sadness. It was efficient, safe, but when you destroyed it, you taught us a lesson. You taught us that safe is an illusion. You taught us that the galaxy is not a garden to be tended, but a storm to be weathered. And you cannot weather a storm in a paper boat. Xylos fell to his knees, his optical sensors overwhelmed by the data radiating from the drive core. You harness the collapse of stars, he stammered. If this containment fails... Holloway looked down at him, her expression softening slightly. It won't, because we built it because we had to. She led them to the bridge, a command center that resembled a planetary operations room more than a ship's bridge. Holographic maps of the galaxy floated in the air, but they were different from the maps the Ethel Guardians used. The borders of empires were faint, almost invisible. Instead, the map was dominated by flow charts of energy, gravity wells, and dark matter currents. We did not build the Prometheus to destroy you, Holloway said, gesturing to the view of the Ethel Guardian homeworld below. If we wanted you dead, we would have simply adjusted our entry vector and let the gravitational wake tear your tectonic plates apart. We wouldn't have needed to fire a shot. The War Prince Kalen, who had been silent since they boarded, finally spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. Then why build this? Why come here? Holloway turned to the main viewport, staring out at the stars. Because you broke our ship. And in doing so, you broke our complacency. We realized that if a neighbor could turn on us so easily over something so trivial as a nebula, then we were not ready for what lies beyond the neighbor. She waved her hand and the holographic map zoomed out. It left the galaxy, pulling back to show the local cluster, then the supercluster, and then the great void beyond. At the edge of the map in the deep dark between galaxies, there was a red stain. It was moving. It was not a fleet. It was a consumption. While we were building this, Holloway explained, her voice grave, our long-range sensors, empowered by the Singularity drive, picked up a signal, or rather the absence of one. Galaxies are going dark, Counselor. Something is eating the light. We call it the entropy tide. The revelation struck Viraika like a physical blow. The petty squabbles over borders, the pride of the hegemony, the fear of the humans, it all rendered down to ash in the face of this new truth. The humans had not built a weapon to punish the Ethel Guardians. They had built a lifeboat. They had built a shield. The Prometheus Unbound was the first of its kind, a ship designed not to conquer a planet, but to survive the death of the universe. "We came here," Holloway said, turning back to face the aliens, "because despite what you did, you are life, you are sentient. And when the dark comes, we will need every light we can find. We did not come to destroy you. We came to ask if you want to help us build the rest of the fleet." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the grand chamber. It was not the silence of fear, but of humility. Virika looked at the war prince, seeing the armor that now looked like a toy, the weapons that seemed like sticks against a hurricane. He looked at Xylos, whose mind was already racing with the possibilities of collaboration, of the physics he could learn, of the survival they could engineer. Virika realized that the humans had conquered them, effectively and totally, without firing a single shot. They had conquered them with vision. They had conquered them by being bigger than the war. "The Star Treader," Virika said, his voice trembling with a sincerity he hadn't felt in centuries. We did not know, we were blind." Holloway nodded slowly. "You were, but now you see, the cost was high. 3,000 souls on that ship. We mourn them every day. But their death forced us to become this. It forced us to grow up. Do not make their sacrifice meaningless by clinging to your pride." She extended a hand, a human gesture, small and fragile against the backdrop of the singularity spinning behind her. "The hull of the Prometheus is made of a collapsed matter alloy. We can show you how to forge it. The drive systems require helium-3 reserves that your territory possesses in abundance. We have the design. You have the resources. Together we might build a wall high enough to keep the night at bay." The transition from enemies to allies was not immediate, nor was it easy. It was forged in the awkward, tense hours that followed, as Ethel Guardian engineers were shuttled up to the great ship, their arrogance stripped away by the sheer undeniable reality of human engineering. They walked the halls of the Prometheus, touching the walls with reverence, speaking in hushed tones with human counterparts who looked at them not with hatred, but with the pragmatic evaluation of a mechanic sizing up a new apprentice. The humans were strange, Virika noted. They held no grudges. It was as if their capacity for anger had been transmuted entirely into a capacity for work. They did not want apologies, they wanted efficiency. They wanted to know the yield of the hegemony's mining colonies, the spectral analysis of their energetic shielding, the thrust-to-weight ratios of their haulers. They were a species possessed, driven by the knowledge of the encroaching dark, and their intensity was infectious. Days turned into weeks, and the Prometheus Unbound remained in high orbit, a second moon in the sky of the Ethel Guardian homeworld. The panic of the populace slowly faded, replaced by a curiosity that bordered on religious fervor. The humans shared their data on the entropy tide, and the science cast of the hegemony confirmed it. The red stain was real. It was accelerating. The realization that their entire history of conquest had been a game played in a sandbox, while a tsunami approached the shore, shattered the Ethel Guardian worldview. The war prince Kalen, initially sullen and resistant, found himself in the gunnery decks of the Prometheus, staring at weapon systems that fired beams of coherent gravity. He realized that his plasma cannons were firecrackers. He spent hours with the human gunnery chief, a scarred man named Rodriguez, who explained that the weapons were not for ship-to-ship combat. "We don't aim at ships," Rodriguez had said, pointing to a simulation of an asteroid field. "We aim at the space the ship occupies. We delete the coordinates." Kalen found a new kind of respect, a terrifying respect, for these soft-skinned creatures who spoke of deleting coordinates as if editing a text file. The diplomatic summit that followed was held not in the grand chamber on the planet, but in the observation lounge of the Prometheus. Virika sat across from Holloway, the table between them displaying the schematic of a new class of ship. It was smaller than the Prometheus, but faster, designed to be built in the Ethel Guardian shipyards. "We call it the Aegis class," Holloway said. "Escort carriers, mobile foundries. If the tide comes, we will need to move populations, not just armies. We need to be able to strip mine a solar system in a week and convert it into shielding." Virika looked at the plans. They incorporated Ethel Guardian aesthetics, the crystalline lattice structures that his people excelled at integrated with the brutalist human drive cores. It was a hybrid, a child of two worlds. "You trust us with this?" Virika asked. "After what we did," Holloway leaned forward, her eyes hard. "Trust is a luxury, necessity is a mandate. You broke our ship, counselor. You showed us we were vulnerable. Now we are ensuring that no one, not you, not us, not the galaxy itself, is vulnerable ever again. We are building a fortress, and we need every brick we can get." The philosophy of the humans was the most jarring reveal. The Ethel Guardians believed in hierarchy and the strong ruling the weak. The humans believed in the chain, A chain is only as strong as its weakest link, they said. Therefore, to strengthen themselves, they had to strengthen everyone around them. It was an inversion of imperial logic that baffled and fascinated the council. They realized that the human empire was not a collection of conquered subjects, but a federation of survivors. They had integrated AI, uplifted species, and former enemies into a singular industrial complex dedicated to the preservation of consciousness. The Prometheus was the physical manifestation of this philosophy, diverse, chaotic, but unified by a singular, unbreakable will. The twist of their nature was that they were not warriors at heart. They were builders who had been forced to learn how to kill, and that made them infinitely more dangerous than a species that loved war. A warrior fights for glory, a builder fights to protect the creation. There is no surrender in a builder, only a redesign of the defense. As the alliance solidified, the first joint maneuvers began. The Ethel Guardian fleet, retrofitted with human shield harmonics, flew in formation alongside the Prometheus. The sight was breathtaking, the sleek insectoid ships of the hegemony darting like hummingbirds around the massive, lumbering whale of the human vessel. They practiced not combat patterns but rescue protocols. They practiced evacuation drills. They practiced shielding a star from a gamma-ray burst. The humans were teaching them how to save worlds, and in doing so they were saving the Ethel Guardians from their own stagnation. But the peace was a fragile membrane over a deep ocean of anxiety. The sensor data from the edge of the void was getting worse. The entropy tide was not just a natural phenomenon, there were patterns in the static. Intelligence. Malice. It was 6 months into the alliance when the Prometheus detected the first scout of the tide. It was not a ship. It was a tear in the fabric of the universe, a dimensional shambler that leaked shadow into the vacuum. It appeared in a border system, an uninhabited rockball that served as a navigational buoy. The Ethel Guardian instinct was to panic, to flee. Admiral Holloway's reaction was calm, immediate, and terrifyingly precise. "Spin up the singularity," she ordered, her voice broadcast to the entire fleet. "Deploy the Aegis Squadron. Virika, have your people stabilize the grav shear. We are going to catch it." The battle that ensued was not a dogfight. It was an industrial accident weaponized. The Prometheus did not fire lasers. It extended its gravity well, grabbing the dimensional horror and pinning it against the fabric of spacetime. The Ethel Guardian ships, moving with a speed they had never dared attempt before, wove a net of plasma fire to cauterize the wound in reality. For the first time in history, the Ethel Guardians fought not for territory, but for the integrity of reality itself. They saw the enemy, a writhing mass of nothingness that defied description, a creature of anti-creation, and they saw the humans engage it. The Prometheus rammed the entity, not physically but gravitationally. The ship's drive core pulsed, a heartbeat of a dying star, and the shockwave shattered the entity's cohesion. It screamed, a psychic scream that bled from the radio spectrum into the minds of every sentient being in the system. And then it was gone, crushed into a subatomic paste by the weight of the human will. In the aftermath, the silence on the bridge of the Prometheus was heavy, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had started this journey. It was the silence of camaraderie. Virika stood beside Holloway, watching the debris of the entity dissolve into harmless radiation. "It was a scout," Virika whispered. "Just a scout." Holloway nodded, wiping a trickle of blood from her nose, a side effect of the gravitational shear. "Yes, a scout, which means they know we are here. They know the lights are still on." She turned to him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a grim smile, but it was real. "We have a lot of work to do, Counselor. We're going to need a bigger ship." The realization hit Virika then. The Prometheus was not the pinnacle, it was the prototype. The humans were already planning the next step. They were planning to move stars. They were planning to build a Dyson swarm not for energy, but for armor. "You are insane," Virika said, but he said it with admiration. "You are a species of madmen," Holloway laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Maybe, but sanity doesn't survive the dark. Madness does, obsession does." She looked back at the star map, at the red stain that was still coming, still hungry. "You broke our ship," she said softly, echoing the words that had started it all. "And you woke us up. For that, history will either curse you or thank you, but either way, we are awake now, and we are not going back to sleep." The story of the Star Treader became a legend, a parable taught in the schools of the new Galactic Union. It was the story of how a tragic mistake birthed a golden age of desperate, frantic innovation. The Ethel Guardians and the humans became the twin pillars of the new order, the architects and the masons. They built the stellar wall. They fortified the spiral arms. They prepared for the long night. The Prometheus Unbound remained the flagship, a symbol of the turning point, A reminder that the most dangerous thing you can do to a human is not to kill them, but to fail to kill them and leave them time to think. Leave them time to build. Years later, on the eve of the Great Arrival, when the sky was finally filled with the shadows of the tide, High Counselor Virika, now ancient and nearing his final molt, stood on the bridge of the Prometheus one last time. The fleet that surrounded them was no longer counted in numbers. It was a sea of metal that stretched to the nebula's edge. There were ships the size of moons, ships that folded space, ships that burned with the fury of captured suns. He looked at the human admiral, the granddaughter of Holloway, who stood with the same stoic calm as her ancestor. "They are here," Virika said. "The end of all things." The admiral shook her head. "No, Counselor, not the end, just the test." She keyed the fleet-wide comms. "All ships," she said, her voice steady. "Hold the line, they broke our ship once, let them try to break this." The universe held its breath. The silence broke. And the Prometheus, the ship born from the ashes of a tragedy, the ship built by grief and forged in the fires of an unbreakable resolve, lit its engines. The light was so bright it cast a shadow across the face of the galaxy, a beacon of defiance screaming into the void. "We are here. We are still here. And we are not moving." The philosophical weight of the moment settled on Virika. He realized that the humans had introduced a new concept to the galaxy, one that the older races had forgotten in their stagnation. It was the concept of spite. Not petty, vindictive spite, but cosmic spite. The refusal to die simply because the laws of thermodynamics said you should. The refusal to yield to a superior force simply because it was superior. The humans had looked at the heat death of the universe, at the predators in the dark, and they had decided to build a machine to punch it in the face. It was absurd. It was illogical. It was beautiful. As the first wave of the tide crashed against the shielding of the Prometheus, the ship didn't just absorb the blow, it fed on it. The hull, designed with the knowledge gained from the destruction of the Star Treader, converted the kinetic energy of the attack into power for the singularity drive. The more the enemy struck, the stronger the ship became. It was the ultimate answer to the trauma of their first loss. "You cannot hurt us," the ship seemed to say. "You can only make us stronger." Virika watched the readouts, watching the energy levels spike to impossible heights, and he laughed. He laughed until his carapace shook. He laughed at the arrogance of the tide, at the foolishness of his own past self, at the sheer, magnificent audacity of humanity. The battle would last for centuries. Civilizations would rise and fall in the shadow of the War of the Tide. But the line held. The Prometheus unbound never fell. It became a fixed point in history, a monument to the day the aliens made the mistake of breaking a human ship. It stood as a testament to the terrifying truth that in the crucible of loss, humanity does not break. It hardens, it sharpens, and it builds. The galaxy had thought it was dealing with a traveler, a wanderer in the dark. They didn't know. They were dealing with the keeper of the fire. And as the singularity flared, turning the darkness into blinding day, the universe learned that you do not extinguish the fire of Prometheus. You only spread it. The diplomatic logs of that era, preserved in the crystalline archives of the Ethel Guardian homeworld, contain a final entry from Virika, recorded moments before the engagement began. It was not a report on troop movements or energy reserves. It was a reflection. "We feared the humans because we thought they were conquerors in disguise. We were wrong. They are not conquerors. They are engineers of defiance. We broke their ship, and in the silence that followed, we assumed they were mourning. They were not mourning. They were measuring. They were calculating the force required to ensure it never happened again. We awoke a giant, and to our great fortune, the giant did not want to step on us. It wanted to carry us. I look at the Prometheus, and I see not a weapon, but a promise. A promise that even if the stars themselves go out, humanity will simply build new ones, and I pity the darkness that tries to stand in their way." The narrative of the universe shifted that day. It moved from a story of inevitable decay to a story of stubborn preservation. The alliance of the shield, born from a moment of violence, became the guardian of life. And at the center of it all, the great black ship, the breaker of tides, the Prometheus, sailed on, an eternal reminder that while aliens might break a ship, they can never break the spirit that built it. The void was vast, and the night was cold, but the fire was hot, and the anvil was ready. The humans had built the most powerful ship ever, not because they wanted to rule the galaxy, but because they refused to let the galaxy rule them. And that, Virika decided as the stars turned to war, was the most terrifying and wonderful thing he had ever seen. The grand chamber where it all began years later was silent again, but it was a peaceful silence. The projection in the center no longer showed the destruction of the Star Treader. It showed the Prometheus, surrounded by the fleet of the Union standing against the tide. It was a memorial, yes, but also a blueprint, For the humans had shared the designs. They had given the secret of the singularity to everyone. "Build your own," they had said. "The dark is big enough for all of us to fight." And so the galaxy became a forest of spears, a phalanx of worlds united by the lesson of the broken ship. The lesson that broken things can be mended and that the scar is stronger than the skin. The Ethel Guardians, once proud and solitary, now stood shoulder to shoulder with the hairy, soft, insane engineers from Sol, looking out into the abyss with a new expression on their faces. Not fear, not arrogance, but anticipation. They were ready. The ship was built. The fleet was gathered. And the story was just beginning. The silence of the void was no longer empty. It was filled with the hum of engines, the sound of a billion worlds breathing in unison, and the quiet, unbreakable whisper of humanity, "Try again. We dare you."